There are rooms in this country where people like Marcus Cole were never supposed to stand. Boardrooms with polished tables and quiet power. Hallways lined with portraits of men who built legacies but erased the hands that helped them. For 20 years, Marcus cleaned those halls, not because he lacked intelligence or ambition, but because someone once decided his name didn't belong on the door, only on the janitor's schedule. But this is not a story about revenge. It's about recognition. It's about the quiet kind of justice that doesn't arrive with applause, but with the turning of a key and the shifting of an entire system. It's about Julian Van Holt, heir to an empire, who dared to question the version of history he was raised to protect. About how a buried will, a forgotten letter, and a single act of courage unraveled decades of silence. This is not just the story of a man who stepped out of the shadows. It's about what happens when power is no longer hoarded, but shared. And when the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one speaking loudest, but the one everyone chose to ignore, until he decided to be seen. So if you've ever been underestimated, ever been overlooked, ever wondered if the world would change, if someone finally stood up, then this story's for you. The sound of crystal clinking against crystal echoed through the grand hall of Holtwood Resort. Everything shimmered under soft golden light. White roses curled around marble columns, a live string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner, and waiters in tuxedos carried champagne flutes with robotic grace. This wasn't just any event. It was the wedding of Julian Van Holt, heir to the Holtwood fortune, and heiress to one of California's oldest vineyard empires. In the shadows near the ballroom entrance, Marcus Cole tightened his grip on the mop handle. His navy blue janitorial uniform was crisp and spotless, but no one noticed. They never did. For the past 2 years, Marcus had worked silently at this very resort, cleaning up spilled cocktails, wiping smeared mirrors, unclogging toilets, always on time, never in the way. At 64, he moved with a deliberate grace, like a man who had once walked taller in a different kind of room. A champagne cork popped nearby. The guests laughed. Music swelled again. Then the voice came deep, confident, and seasoned with just enough charm to fool anyone who didn't know better. Well, well, if it isn't the man of the mop. Ethan Van Holt, owner of the Holtwood Resort chain, stood just a few feet away, perfectly tailored in a slate gray suit, flanked by 2 executives. "Tell me, Marcus. Big plans this Saturday night." Marcus turned slowly. "Just the usual, sir. Clean what needs cleaning." Ethan smiled wider, but his eyes were cold. "Not this Saturday. You're invited." He pulled a sleek envelope from his coat pocket, matte gold with embossed lettering. "Julian's wedding? Right here in the grand ballroom. Dress code formal. We're going all out, so don't show up in that jumpsuit." The men beside him chuckled. Marcus glanced at the envelope, then at Ethan's face. The joke wasn't subtle. It never was. 2 years of mockery wrapped in civility, cruel in its elegance. "I'll be there," Marcus said calmly. Ethan blinked momentarily, caught off guard. "You will." "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. Then he turned and resumed mopping as though the moment hadn't happened. Later that night, in a modest 1-bedroom apartment overlooking a cracked alleyway in East Los Angeles, Marcus set the envelope on his dining table. His fingers moved carefully, not from age, but precision. He opened a drawer under the table, pulled out a locked metal box, and retrieved a small, weathered folder. Inside, yellowing documents. Photos, contracts, handwritten letters. He reached for one in particular, a grainy black and white photograph of 2 young men standing in front of a construction site, both smiling with raw ambition. One of them was Ethan Van Holt. The other, taller leaner, was Marcus. He laid the photo next to the invitation. The corner of his mouth lifted just barely. The next morning, the staff cafeteria buzzed with low conversation. Julian Van Holt sat at a table near the windows, dressed down in jeans and a button-up, sipping coffee. He looked up and smiled when he saw Marcus walking in. "Mr. Cole," Julian called, raising a hand. "Sit with me a sec." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Only if I'm not interrupting your schedule." "You're never interrupting," Julian said. "Honestly, I prefer talking to you more than most people at these events." Marcus sat across from him, hands folded. Julian leaned forward. "So, I heard my dad invited you to the wedding." "You heard right. And you're really coming." "I am." Julian looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Good. I'd like that." There was something about Julian that Marcus had grown to respect over time. The boy man now carried none of his father's cruelty. He treated people by how they moved, not by where they stood on a ladder. But still, Marcus kept his emotions guarded. "Big day for you," Marcus said. "Big day for the whole dynasty." Julian sighed, mimicking his father's pompous tone. "You don't sound thrilled?" Julian laughed dryly. "Truth, I feel like a prop in a business merger. Everyone keeps telling me how perfect this match is for expanding both our family holdings. It's hard to feel like a groom when you're being handed around like an asset." Marcus said nothing. But behind his eyes, something shifted. Julian glanced out the window, lowering his voice. "Sometimes I wonder what my grandfather would have thought of all this. My dad never talks about him." Marcus paused. "What do you know about him?" he asked. "Not much," Julian admitted. "Just that he built the business from scratch and then died when Dad was still in his 20s. Marcus looked down into his hands. "He built more than a business." Julian tilted his head. "You knew him." "I knew him better than your father ever did." Julian stared, but Marcus didn't elaborate. The moment passed. In the days leading up to the wedding, preparations intensified. Trucks arrived with fresh orchids, champagne towers, velvet table runners, golden cutlery. The guest list ballooned to nearly 500 names, including politicians, celebrities, and international investors. The Holtwood name was not just a brand, it was an empire. But behind the spectacle, the truth remained buried. Marcus worked his shifts as usual, quiet, invisible, watching. What no one at the Holtwood estate realized, what even Julian didn't yet know, was that the man who pushed their mop carts at midnight once co-owned every inch of this place. That the janitor they ignored had designed the first business plan, brokered the first land deal, negotiated the first investor terms. That Marcus Cole wasn't just a ghost from Ethan Van Holt's past. He was the architect of everything Holtwood had become, and now he was coming back. Not to reclaim, but to reveal. Not with anger, but with a truth so powerful, no veil of wealth or performance could withstand it. Not for revenge, but to stop history from repeating itself, this time through the next generation. And it would all begin on a wedding night. The morning sun crept gently through the dusty blinds of Marcus's apartment, casting soft lines across the kitchen table. A cup of black coffee steamed quietly beside a stack of old leather-bound notebooks. Marcus had already been up for hours. While the rest of the city scrambled for lattes and rushed into boardrooms, he sat in silence, flipping through pages that chronicled a life most people assumed he'd never lived. Handwritten notes in fading ink marked timelines, names, transactions, dates. Newspaper clippings were neatly folded and clipped between pages, most yellowed, some crumbling at the edges. He stopped at one photo, a 1989 profile of the visionary duo behind Holtwood Resorts. In the image, Marcus stood next to a younger Ethan, both of them laughing in front of a dirt lot that would later become the first Holtwood Resort in Santa Monica. He studied the photo. In it, he still had that fire in his eyes. That man wasn't a janitor. The man in the photo had dreams, ambitions, equity. Marcus closed the notebook. The cover bore the initials MCV, Marcus Cole Van Holt. A name that was never legally recognized, but one Henry Van Holt, Ethan's father, had used without hesitation in private. Marcus had never known his biological father growing up. When Henry entered his mother's life in the 1960s, it was considered scandalous, a white businessman involved with a black woman from South Central LA. But he loved her. And when Marcus was born, he named him with quiet pride, though never publicly. Everything changed the moment Henry died. Ethan erased him, not metaphorically, not symbolically. He literally scrubbed Marcus from the books. The will Henry left behind mysteriously disappeared. Marcus was given a payout and an NDA and threatened with total financial and legal ruin if he ever challenged Ethan's version of events. At the time, Marcus's mother was dying. He made a choice. He walked away, and for 30 years he kept his silence. But now, the son of the man who betrayed him was getting married, and fate had handed Marcus a single invitation to the very stage Ethan had built a top-stolen legacy. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. That afternoon at Holtwood's central office, Marcus took the service elevator to the top floor. Few people noticed him. Fewer still bothered to look. He moved with practiced invisibility, dressed in uniform, pushing his cart past reception and into the executive wing. He stopped outside Ethan's personal office. The door was slightly open. Inside, Ethan stood by the window speaking on the phone. "Don't worry about it," Ethan said, his tone dismissive. "He's just the janitor. Some old guy we hired for diversity optics. He'll make a good punchline at the reception." Marcus didn't flinch. He quietly reached under his cart and pulled out a cleaning rag. With deliberate slowness, he wiped the silver nameplate beside the office door, Ethan R. Van Holt, Chief Executive Officer. It gleamed for a moment before he stepped away. In the adjacent corridor, Marcus entered a rarely used storage room. Behind a shelf stacked with promotional brochures and unopened gift baskets, he removed a small black suitcase. It had sat untouched for years, wedged between crates of outdated banners. Marcus unzipped it and checked its contents. Inside, a certified copy of the original land deed for the first Holtwood property, with 2 names listed, Marcus C. Cole and Ethan R. Van Holt. There was also a notarized letter from Henry Van Holt, dated 3 months before his death, bequeathing 50% of all company equity to Marcus, and a video file saved on a flash drive, Henry's last recorded message to Marcus, filmed in his study. He took out the ring, a simple gold band with the Van Holt crest carved into it. Ethan thought it had been lost when he seized the estate. But Henry had slipped it to Marcus the day before he died. No matter what happens, he'd said, "This is yours." Marcus slid the ring into his pocket. By the end of the week, that ring would speak louder than any announcement Ethan had planned. 3 days later, the resort buzzed with final preparations. Florists rushed in and out. Event planners barked orders into earpieces. Staff polished silverware and replaced centerpieces as if their lives depended on it. Marcus kept to his tasks, calm, steady, unnoticed. Julian passed by briefly, stopping to say hello. "You look sharp today." The young man smiled. "New haircut." Marcus smiled gently, just trying to keep up with the occasion. "You know," Julian added, lowering his voice, "I'm actually glad you're coming. You're one of the only people here who ever listens. Everybody else, I don't know. They see me as the son of Ethan Van Holt, not as Julian." "You're more than your father's name," Marcus said. "You just don't know it yet." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Is that wisdom or prophecy?" "Both," Marcus replied. Julian laughed, then continued on his way. That night, as the rehearsal dinner unfolded in the lounge, Marcus sat outside under a tree, watching fairy lights flicker along the terrace. Through the glass, he saw Ethan mingling glasses, clinking laughter bouncing off marble walls. Julian looked detached, smiling out of obligation. His bride-to-be seemed distracted, her family engaged in hushed conversations with Ethan about investments, vineyard mergers, and offshore expansion. It was never really about love. Marcus exhaled slowly. A waitress stepped outside for a break, lighting a cigarette. She noticed Marcus and nodded politely. "Big event, huh?" Marcus nodded. the kind that changes everything. She smiled, not understanding, then stepped away into the shadows. Marcus checked his phone. A message flashed across the screen. Journalist confirmed. Lawyer's flight lands 7 a.m. He pocketed the phone and walked back inside, past the celebration, past the champagne towers, past the people who still thought he was nobody. No one noticed the man who would rewrite everything. They never do. It began just as the planners had rehearsed every light, perfectly positioned, every crystal flute precisely aligned, and every violin note floating through the grand ballroom like air-drawn lace. The guests arrived in waves, wearing black tie arrogance and couture confidence. Billionaires, senators, socialites, and second-generation magnates glided through the marble foyer with ease, each one greeted with flattery and veiled calculation. At 7:13 p.m., the chandeliers dimmed slightly to signal the start of the reception. A hush swept through the crowd as Ethan Van Holt stepped onto the stage, flanked by his wife Margaret and their son Julian, who looked handsome but strangely out of place in his tailored tuxedo. Ethan smiled like a man who had rehearsed his moment of glory in front of a mirror for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice echoing beneath gold-leaf ceilings. "Tonight is not just the union of two exceptional young people. It is the continuation of legacy." The crowd responded with polite applause. Margaret beamed. Julian kept smiling, but his eyes flicked toward the exits more than once. Ethan continued, speaking of family values, corporate vision, heritage, and strength, each word carefully selected to suggest stability and power. He said nothing about love, or humility, or history. And then the double doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Marcus Cole stepped into the room with the composure of someone born on that very floor, though no one recognized him that way. He wore a dark suit, not new but immaculate. A white dress shirt pressed by his own hands, black shoes that had been shined down to the soles. A single ring on his right finger, gold, with a crest that had once meant something. He didn't stride. He walked. Deliberate, quiet, seen but not yet understood. Conversations paused. People turned. Was it the janitor? Some chuckled softly, others whispered. Near the dessert table, Patricia Grayson, the wife of a hedge fund executive, nudged her friend and smirked. Look who took the invite seriously. At the front, Ethan's expression flickered. For just a second, his grip on the microphone faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Ah," he said, his voice now amplified across the room. "And there he is, our very own Marcus. The man who keeps our floors so spotless we figured why not let him see what they look like under a chandelier." Laughter erupted. Polite, performative, but uneasy. Marcus didn't respond. He walked further into the ballroom, past chairs of mahogany and gold, past faces twisted in amusement or confusion, past the guards near the back who were now watching him with curiosity. And when he reached the third row of tables, he stopped. He turned and looked directly at Ethan. The moment lasted longer than it should have. Long enough for Julian to notice. Long enough for Margaret to glance sideways at her husband. Long enough for the laughter to die without anyone meaning it to. Ethan cleared his throat. "Let's enjoy tonight, everyone," he said, recovering his cadence. "We're here to celebrate." The string quartet resumed. Waiters flowed like water through the room, and Marcus took his seat at the edge of the dance floor. From his vantage point, he could see everything, the smirks, the side eyes, the microaggressions, concealed in polite smiles. But he didn't come to flinch. He had done that years ago. He had swallowed humiliation with silence, choked on injustice to protect others, and buried more of himself than any man should ever have to. This time, he had come with something more powerful than vengeance. He had come with the truth. Julian made his way to Marcus during the first round of toasts. "You really came," the young man said, both surprised and sincerely pleased. Marcus nodded. "I told you I would." Julian offered a glass of water. "You sure you're okay sitting up front? I'm exactly where I need to be." Julian hesitated. Then he leaned closer. "You always looked familiar to me," he said. "Something about your eyes. Like I've seen them before in an old photo album." Marcus smiled softly but said nothing. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Julian raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Something your grandfather gave me. A long time ago. I'll show you later." Julian studied him for a second longer, but then someone called his name, and he was swept back into the dance of ceremony and spectacle. Marcus remained seated, hands folded over the box. As the evening wore on, the speeches grew longer, the applause louder, and the laughter more performative. But under it all, a quiet tension began to build, like the weight in the air before a thunderstorm. It wasn't just Marcus's presence, it was the way he sat. Still, calm, unapologetic. A few guests whispered among themselves. One older woman who had once served on the Holtwood board narrowed her eyes at him and whispered something to her husband. A young caterer paused to refill Marcus's glass and hesitated, unsure if she should even speak to him. "You can pour," Marcus said gently. The girl nodded and did so. "You look nice," she said before hurrying away. At exactly 9:22 p.m., the final toast began. Ethan stepped back up to the stage, glass raised high. "And now," he declared, "before the couple shares their first dance, I want to offer one final note of gratitude." He paused, then turned toward Marcus. "To Marcus Cole for keeping this place standing night after night. Tonight's invitation was unconventional. But hey, it's good to remind ourselves that everyone can appreciate beauty, even if only for one night." Some guests laughed again, but not all. This time, a few glances darted toward Marcus with discomfort, even guilt. Because while Ethan smirked, Marcus stood up. He buttoned his jacket and took a slow step toward the stage. Someone gasped. Julian looked alarmed. Margaret stiffened. "Mr. Van Holt," Marcus said calmly, voice projecting farther than a microphone ever could. "Before you begin your dance, may I say something to the room?" Ethan laughed nervously. "I don't think..." But Marcus continued forward. He wasn't asking. He was claiming. Ethan turned to the crowd, attempting charm. "Well, since our guest of honor has something to say, let's indulge him, shall we?" Marcus reached the center of the stage and looked out over the room full of power, wealth, and legacy. Then he turned toward Julian. "You once asked me," he said quietly, "if I knew your grandfather." Julian stood completely still. "I didn't just know him. I helped build everything he left behind, and everything you see tonight." Whispers rippled. Ethan froze. "I'm not your janitor," Marcus said, holding up the velvet box. "I'm your partner's son, his co-founder. The man erased from every plaque, every credit line, every portrait on these walls." He opened the box. Inside was the Van Holt family crest ring. Julian's breath caught. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I am Marcus Cole Van Holt," he said, and the room fell completely silent. For a moment, no one moved. The ballroom, once humming with clinking glasses and murmured alliances, now pulsed with stunned stillness. The string quartet had stopped mid-note. Guests sat frozen in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, the kind of silence that felt too dense to breathe through. All eyes were locked on the gold ring in Marcus's hand, glowing beneath the chandelier's warm light like a relic risen from the dead. Julian stepped forward slightly, eyes darting between his father and Marcus. "Is this true?" he asked, voice low. Marcus didn't blink. Every inch of Holtwood was built by two men. One of them is standing here. The other was erased. Ethan's smile had vanished. He held the microphone with the stiff fingers of someone grasping at the last fragments of control. "This man," Ethan started, his voice now clipped, "is a former employee who co-signed the original land deed," Marcus interrupted calmly. "Who contributed half the seed capital for the Santa Monica property. Who signed every one of the original founding documents with your father. Until those documents disappeared the day after his funeral." The room stirred. A few murmurs. Some eyes widened. Julian looked back at his mother. Margaret's face was pale. "I have copies," Marcus continued. Notarized. Witnessed. I have the original partnership letter. I have the last video your grandfather recorded addressed to me. I have emails, bank slips, and transfer records. The truth, Mr. Van Holt, is archived. He turned toward the guests now, his voice steady, clear, and impossible to dismiss. I worked these halls for 2 years because I needed to be sure. I needed to see what this place had become. Not the wood or marble, but the soul of it. He turned back to Ethan, and what I found was a man who'd not only stolen legacy, but poisoned it. Ethan laughed, once short nervous. This is a stunt, he snapped. He's just trying to extort us. Playing hero in a suit he probably borrowed. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he pulled a slim silver USB drive from his jacket and handed it to Julian. Play it, he said softly. Julian hesitated. Then he turned to the audiovisual technician at the side of the stage. A moment later, the ballroom screen lit up. A video began. The image was dated a little grainy. But the man on screen was instantly recognizable, Henry Van Holt, white-haired, weary, and seated in what appeared to be his personal study. His voice was unmistakable. If you're seeing this, Henry said, then I'm gone. And Marcus, I'm sorry. I should have fought harder. I should have made sure Ethan couldn't do what I fear he might. The room inhaled collectively. Julian stared at the screen, lips parted. I built Holtwood with you, Henry's voice continued. Not alone. Never alone. Ethan may carry my name, but you carry my legacy. There was a pause as the video crackled slightly. My will was changed last week. Half of everything goes to you, Marcus. Because it was always yours. Gasps. One woman covered her mouth. Someone else whispered, "Is this real?" Then Henry added with a heavy sigh, "If Ethan ignores this, if he hides it, I pray the truth finds its way to the light, even if it takes decades." The screen went black. Julian lowered his head. When he looked up, something in his expression had shifted. Confusion had left. In its place was something new, something harder to define. "Is that why you came back?" he asked Marcus quietly. "To take it all back." Marcus turned to him, and for the first time that night, smiled not with triumph, but with pain. "I didn't come to destroy anything," he said. "I came to save what was still worth saving." Ethan slammed the microphone onto the table. "Enough of this," he shouted. "This ends now." But he didn't realize how much had already ended. The ballroom doors opened again. 2 men entered, one in a tailored gray suit, the other with a leather briefcase. Behind them came a woman carrying a camera and a press badge. Ethan took a step back. No, you don't get to." "Mr. Ethan Van Holt," said the man in the gray suit, "you've been served. Civil summons for fraudulent suppression of partnership agreements, corporate embezzlement, and will tampering. Court appearance in 10 days. The camera flashed. Julian didn't move. Neither did Marcus. Margaret sat down slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. "You think you're going to win?" Ethan hissed, eyes locked on Marcus now. "You think some sob story will make the board back you?" Marcus stepped closer, quiet and firm. "I don't need their sympathy," he said. "I only need the truth." Ethan turned to the crowd. "Are you all seriously entertaining this? This is my company. My father left it to both of you," someone said from the back. Ethan froze. It was one of the original investors, a silver-haired man who hadn't spoken all night. He stepped forward now, voice clear. "I was there when the first deal was signed," he said. "I saw Marcus at every meeting. I wondered why he vanished." Another voice followed, then another. Whispers turned into words. Words into murmurs of agreement. One guest stood and left in silence. Then another. Ethan watched as his empire cracked, not with an explosion, but with a quiet unraveling of belief. Marcus turned and began walking off the stage. Julian caught his arm gently. "What happens now?" he asked. Marcus looked him in the eye. "That depends on what kind of man you want to be." Julian stood motionless on the ballroom floor, his hand still gently holding Marcus's arm as the guests began dispersing around them, some whispering, others quietly slipping out like shadows that no longer belonged to the light. The room no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like an aftermath. The silence between Julian and Marcus was weighted, but not hostile. Marcus met his eyes with calm, not demanding anything, not pushing, not even expecting. Just present, unshaken. Julian finally released his grip and nodded almost imperceptibly. Then he walked off toward the balcony. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been all evening. He braced himself against the carved stone railing and stared into the distant lights of Los Angeles, so many towers of ambition all gleaming from a distance, all hiding stories nobody told. His mother followed a few minutes later. Margaret Van Holt wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, but unfocused. She stopped beside her son, keeping just enough distance that they didn't touch. "You knew nothing, did you?" Julian asked, voice rough. Margaret inhaled slowly, I suspected. He turned to her, wounded. "I didn't know," she clarified. "But I suspected your father had done something buried." I saw how he reacted to any mention of the past. Even when I'd ask about your grandfather's old partners, his answers were always vague. "Why didn't you ask more?" "I did," she whispered. "But I stopped when I realized he had more power angry than I had patient." Julian looked away. So we all just looked the other way while he erased a man. She didn't respond. Behind them, the ballroom crew had begun tearing down the decor. The flowers that once hung like symbols of elegance were now bundled into bins. Champagne fountains drained into buckets. The string quartet quietly packed up their instruments without speaking. And inside, Marcus sat alone at one of the guest tables, turning the gold ring between his fingers slowly. He wasn't watching anyone. He didn't have to. He knew how power behaved when cornered. He had seen it before. When Julian returned, he didn't sit. He stood beside Marcus and asked plainly, "How much of the company is legally yours?" Marcus didn't answer right away. "I'm not here to take the empire," he said. "I'm here to expose how it was built." "That's not what I asked." Marcus looked up at him. 50%. By the original will. If the courts accept the documents, which they will, everything your father owns can be subject to asset freeze and redistribution, including personal accounts. Julian nodded slowly. Marcus studied him. "But I'm not suing you, Julian." Julian blinked. "I could," Marcus said gently. "Your name's on the board. Your signatures are on documents. But I know you weren't part of this. And I believe you're different." Julian sat down across from him, running both hands through his hair. "You realize this will destroy him." Marcus didn't flinch. He destroyed himself. The next morning, the story had already spread across financial media. A video clip of Henry Van Holt's last message to Marcus had gone viral. It played across headlines beneath captions like "The Silent Partner Returns" and "Van Holt Empire Built on Betrayal." By mid-afternoon, the Holtwood stock dipped 15%. At corporate headquarters, board members called for an emergency meeting. And in a small conference room 3 floors below Ethan's corner office, Julian sat across from 3 founding shareholders, each of them older than him, each visibly disturbed. "Your father's not answering calls," said one. "We need clarity," said another. "Is this man legitimate?" Julian exhaled slowly. "He is. Everything he said is real." The room sat in stunned silence. One woman leaned forward. Then the question becomes, what are you going to do about it? Julian stared down at the polished wood table. Then slowly he said, "I want to meet with him privately. No lawyers, no reporters, just him and me." That evening, as the sun began to fade behind the hills, Julian drove himself to Marcus's apartment. He parked in the alley, not in front. No cameras, no witnesses. Marcus was waiting for him at the door, as if he'd known he'd come. Inside the apartment was simple, humble. One framed photo on the wall, Marcus, as a young man standing next to Henry Van Holt, both smiling beneath a coming soon Holtwood Resort sign. Julian stood in front of it, silent. "My grandfather looks proud," he said. "He was," Marcus answered. He believed in building things the right way. Julian turned. Why didn't you come forward sooner? You could have stopped this years ago. Marcus sat down. Because I made a promise to your grandfather. And because I thought justice would come on its own. But it never does. Not unless you drag it to the surface yourself. Julian sat across from him, mirroring the moment from the ballroom. Why now? Marcus looked him in the eye. Because I saw what you were becoming. And I couldn't watch another Van Holt become a man he wasn't born to be. Julian didn't respond for a while. Then he leaned forward, elbows on knees, and said, I want to make this right. Not just to fix the company, but to fix the truth. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a big task. Julian nodded. I'm ready for it. Marcus studied him and then opened the drawer beside him. He pulled out a thin folder and placed it on the table. What's that? Julian asked. A roadmap, Marcus said, of how we rebuild Holtwood. Together. Clean. Julian opened the folder and scanned the contents. Financial breakdowns, whistleblower protections, leadership restructuring plans, equity redistributions. It was more than a retaliation. It was a rebirth. You planned all this? Julian asked. Marcus nodded. For 20 years. Julian exhaled and sat back. I guess the only question now is whether I'm strong enough to lead it. Marcus stood. You don't have to be strong, he said. You just have to be honest. The days that followed unfolded like the slow unraveling of an old, carefully stitched lie. At Holtwood headquarters, the energy shifted. People no longer walked the halls with the same blind confidence. Doors that were once always closed began to stay ajar. Conversations lowered in volume. The building felt like it had begun holding its breath. Behind glass conference rooms, a quiet investigation had begun. A third-party law firm, independent and ruthless, was brought in to conduct a full internal audit. It wasn't announced with press releases or corporate memos. It moved silently, like smoke through a vent, and it started with names. Names of employees who'd filed complaints, quiet ones often ignored. Names of contracts that had been signed in secret. Names of board members who had long since stopped asking questions. Julian stood by the window of his father's former office, watching as the parking lot below slowly emptied for the night. In his hands was a file folder thick with inconsistencies. 14 contracts without countersignatures, he said without turning. Shell companies, missing invoices. We're sitting on at least 5 years' worth of manipulated reporting. Behind him, Marcus sat calmly reviewing a separate file. And the staff records, he asked. Julian turned weary. 37 cases of denied promotions for qualified candidates. 28 of them women. 24 of them people of color. Some had been waiting years. One of them was a former executive assistant who trained 2 of the men who got promoted ahead of her. Marcus nodded slowly. That's not a mistake, he said. That's a pattern. The truth was pouring out now. Not in fury, not in drama, but in document spreadsheets and time-stamped signatures. But Ethan Van Holt had not disappeared. He had gone quiet. And that Marcus knew was more dangerous. He'd seen it before. Men like Ethan didn't respond with apology. They responded with strategy. The first strike came 2 days later. An article appeared in a well-respected financial magazine. Anonymous sources. Language that walked the legal line, but hit hard in implication. Questions emerge about Marcus Cole's identity. Claims of undocumented past. A man with no formal education history suddenly appears with accusations no one can verify. Julian read it in silence. When he looked up, his jaw was clenched. We should sue. Marcus shook his head. No. Why not? Because this isn't about the article, Marcus said. It's about distraction. If we chase noise, we abandon the signal. That evening, Marcus took a drive out to Pasadena, a small, quiet neighborhood. He parked in front of a modest house with a rusted mailbox and a humming porch light. When Gloria Myers opened the door, she gasped softly. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "I was," Marcus said. "But not anymore." She let him in without another word. Gloria had been Henry Van Holt's personal assistant for over a decade. She'd typed the original will. She'd sealed the envelope that held the letter Henry wrote Marcus, the one that never reached him. She had stayed quiet all these years because she believed no one would listen. Now, for the first time, someone was asking. Marcus sat at her kitchen table, a recorder between them. "I have the original draft," she said, opening a locked metal box. "And a journal." Henry kept notes on everything, especially toward the end. Marcus didn't speak. He only listened. By the time he left her home, the evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was undeniable. The next morning, Julian opened the folder Marcus handed him, and his face went pale. "These aren't just copies," he said. "No," Marcus replied. "They're originals, time-stamped, witnessed, and stored with someone Henry trusted." Julian shook his head slowly. "This changes everything." Marcus watched him closely. "It confirms everything he corrected. Now we act." Later that afternoon, they sat down with the firm leading the internal audit. Evidence was presented, documents shared, testimonies recorded. The air in the room was sterile, clinical, but beneath it all was the sense that something monumental was shifting. That night, Ethan resurfaced. He held a press conference, private, invitation only, carefully controlled. The setting was subdued. A gray backdrop, a single chair, and Ethan Van Holt dressed in a navy suit, hands folded like a man preparing to deliver a eulogy. He didn't speak with fire. He spoke with poison. "I have built Holtwood with integrity," he said, "and I have been betrayed." He called Marcus a man with no verified identity. He called Julian young, impressionable, vulnerable to manipulation, and he ended with a threat dressed in civility. "I will let the courts decide who owns Holtwood. But make no mistake, this isn't over." By morning, Marcus received notice of a countersuit. Allegations of defamation, identity fraud, corporate sabotage. Julian sat with the papers in front of him, unmoving. "He's coming after everything he said. Your name, my credibility, the company's future." Marcus folded the letter calmly. "Of course he is," he said, "because he knows the truth won't die quietly anymore." Julian looked at him, uncertainty flickering in his expression. "What if this drags out for years? What if we lose?" Marcus's eyes didn't waver. "Then we keep showing up," he said. "Every day. With truth. With proof. With dignity." There was a long silence. Then Julian leaned forward. "Let's take him to court." Marcus nodded, not like a man who wanted revenge, but like a man who was finally ready to finish what was started. The courtroom wasn't built for spectacle. No marble pillars or dramatic staircases. Just rows of pale wood benches, fluorescent lighting, and silence heavy enough to press against the walls. But that morning, when the Van Holt hearing began, the room felt anything but ordinary. Dozens of journalists waited outside. Security was tight. The court clerk called the case in a voice that barely wavered, but even she knew the weight of what was unfolding. Julian entered first alone, not flanked by lawyers, not wearing the kind of mask men in his position are trained to wear. He walked with a quiet kind of gravity, the kind that only comes from knowing you're not just showing up for yourself. He was followed by Marcus. No entourage, just calm, just presence. Across the aisle, Ethan sat with a team of 6 attorneys, each dressed like a warning. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't acknowledge Marcus. But his knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the polished table. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for zero tolerance and razor-sharp memory, entered. "We are here today." She began to consider a formal petition challenging the validity of inheritance and ownership claims regarding the Van Holt estate corporate holdings and will authenticity. Both parties claim rightful standing. One alleges fraud. The other alleges concealment. "Let's begin." What followed wasn't dramatic. Not at first. It was methodical, deliberate, foundational. Marcus's legal team began by introducing Henry Van Holt's original will, one never filed, never disclosed. The signature matched 10 other verified documents. The notary, long since retired, submitted a sworn affidavit. The timestamp matched a week before Henry's death. Next, they introduced the sealed letter, the one Henry had written to Marcus. A forensic handwriting expert confirmed its authenticity. Then came Gloria Myers. She walked into the courtroom slowly, her cane clicking against the floor. She wore a simple navy dress and glasses with thick black frames. When asked to speak, she did so without hesitation. "I was there when Mr. Henry Van Holt signed the amended will," she said. "I was there when he sealed the envelope addressed to Marcus Cole. And I was there the morning after his death when Mr. Ethan Van Holt entered the study alone and came out with that envelope missing." There was a pause. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" the judge asked. Gloria looked at Ethan, then back at the judge. "Because I was scared." Julian kept his eyes on his father the entire time. He was waiting for something, a flicker of remorse, a break in the armor, but it never came. Ethan sat unmoved. Next came the forensic accountant. Then the IT expert who traced document deletions to Ethan's office server. Then the handwriting analyst. Each one reinforced what Marcus had said from the beginning, that the truth hadn't been lost. It had been buried. But the moment the courtroom truly shifted came near the end of that first hearing. The court clerk wheeled in a monitor. Marcus stood walking forward slowly. From his pocket he pulled a small USB drive and passed it to the technician. "This," he said, "is a video never seen by the public. It was recorded 1 week before Henry Van Holt's death. It was meant for the company board but was never delivered." The screen lit up. Henry appeared seated at his desk, face tired but clear-eyed. "If you're watching this," he said, "then something has gone terribly wrong." He paused, breathing in deeply. "I've amended the will. I've reviewed the documents. Marcus Cole is not only my business partner, he is family, and he is entitled to half of everything Holtwood owns. I've given Ethan a chance to understand this, but I fear he won't. And if he tries to stop this from coming to light, then you'll know exactly why." Julian felt his chest tighten. On screen, Henry looked directly into the camera. "If you're sitting in a courtroom right now, let it be known my legacy is not a building. It's the people I trusted. And Marcus, I trust you." The video ended. Silence. Complete. Even Ethan's attorneys didn't move. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Van Holt," she said, addressing Ethan, "would you like to respond to that?" For the first time in the entire proceeding, Ethan looked small, not defeated, but cornered. And that was when Julian stood up. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "may I speak?" The judge tilted her head. "You are not on trial here, Mr. Julian Van Holt. But if you wish to make a voluntary statement for the record, I'll allow it." Julian looked at his father, then at Marcus, then at the judge. "I was raised to believe that loyalty mattered more than truth," he said. "That power protected itself. That names like ours didn't need to explain themselves." He paused. "But I've learned that silence is just complicity in disguise. And I won't be silent anymore." There was movement at Ethan's table. One of the attorneys leaned in to whisper, but Ethan didn't react. Julian continued. "I support Marcus's claim. I support the truth. And I'll testify under oath if necessary." The courtroom exhaled. Marcus looked down, not to hide emotion, but to breathe through it. The judge nodded slowly. "We'll reconvene next week for formal review of the will and standing. Until then, court adjourned." The gavel struck once. Outside, the world waited. Inside, justice had just taken its first breath. Outside the courthouse, the world no longer waited quietly. By noon, clips of Julian's statement had flooded the news cycle. Every major outlet ran the headline, "Julian Van Holt turns against his father in court." Underneath it, a still image of him, standing tall, shoulders square face, unreadable but gaze unwavering, spread across social media like a signal flare in a storm. Inside Holtwood's upper floors, panic bloomed. The board had called an emergency meeting within 2 hours of the hearing. 5 members dialed in remotely. 3 sat around the table in person. And 1 chair, Ethan's, remained empty. He hadn't shown up. Instead, his legal team had sent a letter citing health-related fatigue and unwarranted reputational damage. But no one believed that. They all knew Ethan Van Holt was retreating. And in the space left behind, something else began to move. Julian walked into the boardroom without hesitation. He wore no tie. His sleeves were rolled to the forearms. His face looked sharper now, like truth had become its own armor. "We're at a fork," he said, not waiting for permission to begin. "We can pretend this is temporary. We can hope this dies down. Or we can fix the rot." No one interrupted him. He placed a single document at the center of the table. It was a restructuring plan, not just for optics, for real. Equal pay reform, transparent promotion tracks, community reinvestment policies, a formal reinstatement of Henry Van Holt's original will, acknowledging Marcus not only as heir, but as co-founder equal in vision and weight. "You want to protect the brand," Julian said. "Start by honoring the truth behind it." A long silence passed. Then the oldest board member, a woman who'd known Henry from his first hotel project in the 80s, finally spoke. "I remember when your father was just a name on a second signature line," she said. "This company was never supposed to become about one man. It was about what we built together." She signed the motion. One by one, the others followed. That night, Ethan sat alone in his home office. The lights were off. Only the glow of a television reflected against his face. He was watching footage from the hearing, his son standing in court saying, "I won't be silent anymore." He didn't blink, didn't move. But deep in his chest, something burned, not anger. Loss, the loss of control, of image, of his version of history. A sound broke through the silence. A knock. He turned toward the door. It opened slowly. Helena stood there, dressed in travel clothes, a suitcase handle still clutched in one hand. "I came to say goodbye," she said, voice steady. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said. "I already did," she replied, "when I stayed quiet for 20 years. He tried to speak, but she cut him off. "I believed you when you said it was better to keep the truth buried. But all we did was bury ourselves with it." She walked away without waiting for a response. And for the first time in Ethan Van Holt's life, no one came back. Across the city, Marcus stood in a small apartment surrounded by boxes. Not packing, unpacking. He placed a photo on the bookshelf. It was of Henry laughing, head thrown back, sleeves rolled up. A man in the middle of a story that had never been allowed to finish. Julian arrived 10 minutes later, holding a bottle of wine and 2 paper cups. "We're going to relaunch the foundation," he said, sitting down. "The one named after my grandfather. Not as a PR stunt, as something real. Education, housing, restitution." Marcus smiled. "Not broadly, but enough. I'd like you to run it with me," Julian added. Marcus poured the wine, handed him a cup, and said only 2 words. "Let's begin." By the end of the week, Ethan's attorneys filed for settlement. It was quiet, private. But word got out anyway. Ethan Van Holt would step down from all corporate roles, surrender executive decision rights, and divest 40% of his holdings, half of which would go directly to a newly formed employee equity trust. No admission of guilt, no apology. But everyone understood what it was. Surrender dressed in paperwork. A man once at the helm of an empire, now reduced to footnotes in its rebirth. And Marcus, he didn't claim a mansion or a title. He chose a small office in the employee wing next to HR, across from wellness. He came in early, left late. He walked the hallways like someone who had never forgotten what it meant to be invisible. And Holtwood changed, not because of press releases, because of policy, because of who was in the room now, because of who finally had a seat at the table. One afternoon, Julian stood alone in the now renamed Henry Van Holt Community Hall. He looked out over rows of interns, new hires, and scholarship recipients. He was no longer afraid of sharing power. He had learned that sharing it didn't diminish it. It multiplied it. And somewhere deep down, he understood what Marcus had been teaching all along, that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you repair, what you return, what you lift, what you finally fully tell the truth about. 6 months later, the name Holtwood didn't mean the same thing anymore. In some places, it meant renewal. In others, atonement. But in every headline, every whispered conversation in corporate corridors, every business school case study, it had become something rare, a symbol of repair. The Employee Equity Trust was no longer a concept. It had begun to change lives, paying for daycare, forgiving medical debt funding the night classes of employees who'd been stuck in entry-level roles for years. The janitor who once mopped the 16th floor boardroom was now studying accounting. The receptionist at the lobby desk had just received her certification in HR. Inside Holtwood's new community wing, a wall had been dedicated to letters, handwritten notes from staff interns, single mothers, former part-timers, now framed in clean glass. Each one began the same way. You probably don't remember me. But someone had. Marcus walked the halls most people avoided. He lingered in break rooms, ate lunch outside with the security guards. He rarely attended the board meetings, those were Julian's now. But he attended the quiet places, the invisible spaces. That's where the work had always been. One morning, as he walked past the loading dock, he was stopped by a young woman named Lila, new to the operations team. She handed him a folded envelope. "This came for you. No return address. But they sent it express, handwritten, just your name." He thanked her quietly. Inside his office, he waited a moment before opening it. The paper was thick, cream-colored. The handwriting, elegant, old-fashioned. It was from Ethan. "Marcus, I don't expect you to read this. I wouldn't blame you if you burned it. But I'm writing not to beg. Only to say I've been watching from a distance. And what you've done is the very thing I thought was impossible. You didn't destroy me. You didn't gloat. You built something. You returned dignity to a name I tried to turn into a weapon. And maybe that's the difference between us. I thought power was about preservation. You showed it's about release. I don't ask forgiveness, but I do ask that when they say my name, my children, my grandchildren, they say it next to yours. Because the truth is, they were never mine to keep alone." Marcus sat with the letter for a long time. He didn't cry, but he didn't move either. Not for a while. Then slowly he folded it again carefully like something sacred and slid it into a drawer. Not as a trophy, as a record. Weeks later, Julian stood on a small stage in the newly inaugurated Holtwood Leadership Academy. Behind him was a group of graduates, many of whom had once scrubbed its floors or answered phones behind plexiglass. He was there to give a speech. But halfway through he stepped aside. "I won't close today," he said, smiling. "Because the man who built this wasn't me." Marcus walked up slowly. He didn't carry notes, didn't need them. He looked out at the audience, then down at his hands, as if remembering the years when they only gripped broom handles and clipboard checklists. Then he looked up. "I was raised to believe," he began quietly, "that justice was something you waited for. That dignity was something given to you if you behaved long enough." He paused. "I was wrong." He walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, speaking now, not to the crowd, but directly into the moment. Justice is something you build. Dignity is something you carry even when no one sees it. The room was silent. "You will be underestimated," he said. "You will be ignored. And sometimes you will be punished just for standing in a room where someone believes you don't belong." He looked at the youngest faces in the crowd. "And when that happens, don't shout. Don't fight to be seen." He smiled faintly. "Become undeniable." The audience rose, not in applause, in reverence. That night, Marcus sat on the rooftop garden, once Ethan's private terrace, now open to every staff member in the building. Julian joined him, 2 mugs of tea in hand. They didn't speak at first, just sat in the stillness of a city that for once felt like it was breathing in rhythm. Finally, Julian turned to him. "What now?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Now we step back, so others can step forward. Julian nodded. What should we call this chapter? Marcus looked out at the skyline, then said almost to himself, redemption doesn't need a name. It just needs to keep going. And under the stars, with the wind brushing gently through the leaves of a garden, built atop what used to be a monument to ego. Two men sat no longer trying to own anything, only to protect what had finally been made right. 1 year later, a brass plaque was unveiled on the wall of the newly opened community center on the south side of the city. It read, "The Henry and Marcus Foundation, for those still waiting to be seen." There were no fireworks, no ribbon-cutting spectacle, just a quiet afternoon ceremony. Sunlight pouring through the tall glass windows and the soft hum of possibility in the air. Inside, young people lined up to register for mentorship programs. Single parents waited in line for legal aid. And in one corner, a scholarship counselor handed out the first check to a 17-year-old girl who had just been accepted into a university neither of her parents had finished high school to dream of. Julian stood at the edge of the crowd, watching it all unfold. Then he turned. Marcus was there, older now, tired but alive, in a way no one had seen in him before this year. "I think we've started something," Julian said. "No," Marcus replied. "They've started something. We just remembered how to hand over the keys." They stood together in silence, two men who had once inherited a legacy of silence and violence, and turned it into something that breathed. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone at home, flipping through a small box of letters he had kept from the early days. There were notes from staff, from students, even a letter from Helena, postmarked from another state. But one stood out. It was a letter written by Henry, not the business will, not the public statement, but a handwritten note dated 10 years before Marcus had ever walked through Holtwood's doors. It read, "If this ever reaches you, know that I tried. I failed many things, but I never stopped believing that you were out there, that one day you'd find your way through all the rooms people tried to keep you out of, and when you do, don't fight to belong. Redefine the room." Marcus folded the letter, pressed it to his chest for just a moment, then placed it gently back in its envelope. Not to forget, but to finally let go. 3 weeks later, Marcus left the office for the last time. No press, no speech, no announcement. Just a quiet note on his door that read, "Gone to plant something new." But inside his old desk, tucked beneath the top drawer, was a sealed envelope addressed to Julian. When Julian opened it, he found two things, a simple brass key and a handwritten message. "You were always brave enough. Now you're ready to lead without apology. Be firm, be kind. And when the next Marcus walks through your door, don't wait 20 years to see him. M." Julian stared at the letter for a long time, then smiled, not because it was over, but because he knew it would never be. Justice, he now understood, wasn't a moment. It was a rhythm, a practice, a daily quiet choice. And the best stories, the ones that change the world, don't end. They hand you the pen and ask, what will you write next? Sometimes justice doesn't look like a courtroom verdict. It looks like a man leaving the building through the front door, not with a title, but with his dignity. It looks like a company that finally learns to see the people who were always there. It looks like two children who will grow up, not carrying the weight of silence, but the strength of truth. Marcus never raised his voice, but he changed everything, not by demanding power, but by proving he had always deserved it. And in the end, that's what this story reminds us, that no matter how long it takes, no matter how invisible the path may feel, there is always a way forward if you walk it with character, not ego. If this story moved, you stay with us, because we believe in telling the stories that others try to hide. Stories of dignity, of justice, of quiet revolutions. Subscribe to the channel and be part of the change, because somewhere right now, someone else is still waiting to be seen, and their story might be next.